There we go. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening to anyone listening in to this conversation. My name is Henrik Syse. I'm a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. I'm also a part-time professor at Björknes University College. And maybe most important in this particular connection, I'm also the editor, co-editor of the Journal of Military Ethics, a peer-reviewed journal from Taylor and Francis, and we'll touch on issues that are important to that journal in this conversation. I'm really fortunate today because I have with me both a good friend and a person truly worthy of being listened to. Betsy Kawamura, I'll get the pronunciation right. Wonderful to have you with me and with us, Betsy. And our theme today is one that we've raised at various points in the Journal of Military Ethics, but probably need to talk more about, and that's the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And how we raise the truly crucial ethical issues that this agenda raises. And the fascinating thing about you, Betsy, is that you have engaged with this not just as an academic topic, but also as an activist and as someone with a set of experiences from your own life that really speaks to this issue. And not least, you've been very preoccupied with how we can raise this issue in the North and Northeast Asia context, which is one where this has been a historical burden, to put it mildly. Yet, a lot of people don't really know the history, and something that preoccupies you very much. A lot of people engaged in the military who can do something about gender-based violence don't really know the history, and therefore probably don't know enough about what to do about it today. So that's all I'll say. I'll try to stay in the background here because you are the one to talk, but welcome, Betsy. Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning or maybe good evening to people around the world. And I really appreciate it. Like Henrik said, you know, we've known each other for several years now, and I appreciate you letting me do a presentation at PRIO in 2017. And I think that's when I ignited an interest in the people here in Norway and other parts of the world as to what we do not know about women, peace and security issues for Northeast Asia. As you were asking before, and on the in the interview questions, what ignited my interest is that, you know, I am myself, unfortunately, a survivor of childhood and adult gender-based violence. Gender-based violence means sexual violence, rape, sexual assault. It's kind of a loose term, but it's been more recently used to describe basically rape and allied crimes. My incidents occurred when I was a child in Okinawa. It was 1973 or 4. It was during the height or towards the end of the Vietnam War. And I remember as a child, just seeing all these, like, you know, B-52 bombers over in Okinawa. My father was working for the military as a civilian. I was born in California, but we moved to Okinawa for my father's job. And this is for 1963 till about 1974-5. And unfortunately, towards the last few days of my being in Okinawa, you know, I became intercepted by this American person, most likely in the military. He sexually assaulted me for several days when I was in Okinawa. He knew exactly where I lived, unfortunately, and intercepted me on the way to going to school. Christ the King School that is no longer there. So during the 5 days, or nearly, I think between 3 and 5 days before I left, he sexually assaulted me, did everything except sexual intercourse. And on the very end, he actually paid me $5, thanking me for my services. And he also basically said without a flinch of guilt in his eyes that he was sexually assaulting his own daughter, which he thought he had the right to do. So, you know, this is one of the things in life that you don't expect to encounter. So in a technical way, you can say that I started to become aware of these issues, probably not as an activist, but, you know, as like a precocious child, aware of these issues since I was 12 or 13. Now, I would have never guessed that I would be growing up to be an activist in this, because, you know, as you probably know, in Northeast Asia, it's very discomforting. It's very uneasy to talk about sexual violence. You know, I mean, even here in Norway, where I've been for the last off and on about like 36 years now, off and on, you know, talking about sexual violence or gender-based violence is extremely difficult. But when, you know, but when you're from Far East Asia, We don't necessarily have the retaliatory measures as they do in the Middle East of honor killings. We do not go that far. But in Northeast Asia, we have this very quiet, but very palpable, don't tell situation. Because if you say something about use of sexual-based violence, your chances of having a nice partner, a boyfriend, a lover, your social standing in society, even your chances of finding a job if you become visible are really decreased. So there is an incredibly effective and sinuous social pressure without written rules of staying silent. And this unfortunately has pervaded since like World War II. The presence of the US military in Japan and Okinawa right after the capitulation of Japan. And not too many people know about this, but there is the Recreation and Amusement Association, which I think is a terrible way to describe basically sexual servitude, recruitment by the Japanese military from the Japanese women and the Okinawan women to sexually serve the US military and other allied forces occupying Japan and Okinawa. I mean, how they come up with these names, Henrik, recreation and amusement. I mean, exactly what part of sexual slavery is amusement? It behooves me. But that is one of the things, and people know more about Korean comfort women. If you talk about Northeast Asia, and you talk about sexual violence, most people would say like, yes, we know basically about the South Korean comfort women. But if you say something about the Japanese or the Okinawa women who are recruited for the American military, you draw a blank. And this is one of the most perfect examples of geopolitical obfuscation that I've been ranting and raving about. This geopolitical obfuscation is such that when I had asked some of my colleagues in the United States, they're part of the US military academies. I've contacted a colleague of mine in NATO in Brussels. And I talked to a few of my UN colleagues in New York, whether they knew about this Recreation and Amusement Association. And later on, I'll get back to your article that your colleague wrote, Alistair McLaughlin. I have a copy here. And I hope that it shows it's not mirrored, it's like the proper article. It shows about war crimes and crimes against humanity in Okinawa, guilt on both sides, meaning, guilt from the Japanese side and the Okinawan side. I mean, I think these issues are not known because the Japanese government and the American government simply do not want the international people to know about it. Because if they do know about it, it's going to raise lots of questions of accountability. Why were these issues, including sexual gender-based violence, the Recreation and Amusement Association, not brought up by the Tokyo Tribunal? And last night, before I went to bed, it's not exactly the best bedtime story, but I read a little bit more about the criticism behind the Tokyo Tribunal. There's like Judge. What is his name? Justice Paul from Calcutta. You probably know about him. He raised all these questions about the fact that there's no impartiality, and he basically said, I think it was him and his colleagues who basically said that the victors of war should not be the ones like creating this so-called justice and tribunal, because there's always going to be lack of impartiality. So my overall conclusion is that this conspiracy of silence, which I would really like to emphasize. I mean, it is a nasty conspiracy of silence that if you say something about this, it's going to be really painful for the consequences. And the fact that, as I said, most of the people in Japan, the younger generation, people in New York, the UN, very few academics know about this, I did a lot of research with academia, and there's like Dr. Sarah Kovner. She's teaching now at Columbia. I mean, she did this like remarkable book. I think you can see it. Yeah. It's about occupying power, sex workers, and service members in post-war Japan. Now you have like all these different books, and here's like another one of my favorites. And this is like a very auspicious sounding title. Let the Good Times Roll. It's basically about prostitution in the US military in Asia. And then, this is not some leftover thing in 1970s. And as like a kind of like a marker to this, I picked this up in Hawaii. It's a nasty brochure. What it is basically appealing to Japanese and mostly Japanese, but Asian tourists in Hawaii when they're on vacation, and to ask them to enter these like sex clubs. Now, the reason why I bring this up is like it's amazing. There's like the resolution 1325 for women, peace, and security for basically for us who know it's a UN Security Council 1325, which was created to create like awareness of sexual gender-based violence in conflict and war. And the initiatives were to have a more inclusive Security Council where women, especially, and including sexual gender-based violence survivors, to speak up with their voice about UN Security Council resolutions, what could be done to improve the situation and to forge a way towards peace, believing that the inclusion of women's voices will forge like a much more direct mention for peace. The national action plans have been written up by the United States and Japan, the Philippines. China, I don't think is working towards that. Mongolia maybe has started discussing, but basically we, you and I sitting here in Scandinavia, our Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, many countries in Western Europe, Africa, parts of Southeast Asia have created a national action plan. Now that is great. I'm very happy. President Obama, what he has done is like there was an executive order during his like last 4 years in office where he created an executive order to have the national action plan done. I commend both Japan and United States for that. The problem is that they don't talk about the Recreation and Amusement Association. They do not talk about, they plainly do not discuss some of the war crimes issues mentioned on this. And I mentioned this paper so importantly because it does mention, rape, sexual violence. And the interesting fact, I didn't even know about this, that once again, the Japanese Imperial Army recruited Korean women and men to go into Okinawa, not just mainland Japan, but Okinawa for sexual servitude for the Japanese Imperial Army. And as a consequence of that, as I understand, reading the footnotes, that there must have been many Okinawan women who were also sexually assaulted by the U.S. military. Now, let me ask
you there, and thank you for this disturbing but very important background. But you refer to our article from the journal Military Ethics. It was printed in 2015, yes, written by Alistair McLaughlin, who unfortunately passed away in 2014 after having finished the article. And we are very proud to have reproduced it in our journal because he did a lot of important work on this. He wrote other things as well, but I think this was an article, this was an article he was very proud of because a lot of research went into it. And of course, it's a sort of coincidence because this is about Okinawa towards the end of the Second World War. Your personal story from the Okinawan island is from 20 years later. But my question would be the following. If our agenda now is to make members of armed forces more conscious about sexual and gender-based violence in the military and in war, what is the usefulness of these historical accounts? Why would it matter today to know more about what happened in 1944 or 1969? And you and I both think that this is important. We think history is obviously important, but others could say, no, we need to put history behind us. We need to stop talking about Korean comfort women now because we've talked about that for too long. Your thesis seems to be, no, we haven't talked by far enough about the sexual violence, not least the fact that there has been perpetration of this on all sides in conflict. But please tell me a little bit about why you find history important in this context.
Okay, the reason why it's really important is this, what if, what if nobody knew about the Holocaust? That's usually the question, that's the response I give, the situation is that the Recreation and Amusement Association, the sexual gender-based violence that occurred, post-World War II, the Battle of Okinawa, these are things that many people do not know about. In great contrast, many people know about the Holocaust. So I basically ask these people, what if you guys didn't know about the Holocaust? What if the Nazi regime, Hitler's cohorts were the ones who conquered the war in Berlin? history would be rewritten in a very, very different way. And, I'm asking, am I asking these people also too? It's like, if you were a doctor, let's say that you're like a very, well-esteemed doctor and you're looking at the Northeast Asia women, peace and security issues or peace issues and the context of the conflicts between North and South Korea, Japan, China, and the inclusion of the geopolitical importance of the United States in the region. I mean, and if you're a doctor and if you're trying to improve and heal the region, wouldn't you want to do like an in-depth patient historical recording of the patient's history way in the past? And because to be able to understand and to be a really good healer physician, you really have to go into the patient's real past, not just try to create like a Band-Aid, like just like a plaster Band-Aid, slap it on the person's, wrist and everything and give him an aspirin and say, I hope you feel better in the next couple of days and just come back. When I talk about the women, peace and security issues and the amount of trauma and grief that has happened in Far East Asia and the fact that it hasn't been, recognized, it hasn't been understood, it hasn't been, there's no education about it. And there is like an incredible lack of knowledge between, as I said, the UN, the military academies, even NATO, and many of the academics here. And, people insist on trying to, the think tanks, wonderful people in think tanks like PRIO and everything, and the education want to create more peace in Northeast Asia, not understanding the past. I think that if people understood better, some of the issues that I'm talking about, they would recognize why South Korean comfort women issues are still on the agenda. And they will understand, there is like a certain gap of knowledge, why more people do not know about North Korean refugee women who are hiding in China, for instance. And part of the reason I bring this up is that I had like a really nice, informal conversation with a colleague of mine in UN in New York. And she said, like, Betsy, isn't there a possibility to create some kind of like a platforming of synergies amongst the comfort women of Korea, South Korea as we know it, the North Korean refugee women, Okinawan and Japanese women who've been used as sexual for servitude by the US military during World War II, whoever's remaining, and to create some kind of synergies and to create a platform. And when I first heard this from her, in theory, yes, it sounds really great, but I had to laugh because no government would want that. I mean, Henrik, simply the American government, the Japanese government would definitely not want that solidarity. The only persons, the only entities would be kind of chuckling or laughing about it, ironically, with the North Koreans and maybe the Chinese, saying that finally, we as North Koreans or Chinese are not the worst people in this equation when it comes to women, peace, and security. The Japanese and the Americans, because of the lack of historical, understanding and lack of teaching. Finally, there's a few persons like Betsy Kawamura and other advocates who understand this thing, so that there'll be a much more balanced way of looking at the region of Northeast Asia from the women, peace, and security lens. And this is what's missing. I mean, a lot of people talking about Northeast Asia, we keep on talking about the nuclear missile threats. We could talk about military threats and the geopolitical threats from so-called North Korea and China, for the West, to Japan and USA and to South Korea. However, Henrik, what I've been advocating for the past, over 10 years is to look at women, peace, and security, or the situation in Northeast Asia through the WPS lens.
WPS is women, peace, and security,
yes,
just to remind the listener.
Security lens. If you look at it through that lens, then you will understand why the South Korean comfort woman, is still not really healed. The fact that, that North Korea and China has the issues of the Nanjing massacre.
Yeah.
That the fact that Japanese has reached into places even far from Asia, including into Indonesia, into the Dutch persons for recruiting them to comfort women issues. And the fact that Okinawa and Japan, these women recruited to serve the US military, have not been talked about because it's geopolitically inconvenient. When you basically have North Korea and North Korea and China as potential enemies, anything that's seen as a threat towards the front united alliance between Japan and the USA will be seen as a threat.
Yep. Yeah.
So
No, the
what I'm talking
geopolitical.
about
Yeah, I
is
know
not
that.
popular.
I know. It's the geopolitical situation that partly makes it unpopular. Just wanted to say to the viewer that I'm very fortunate to be here with Betsy Kawamura, an activist and truly knowledgeable person about the women, peace and security agenda, but not least about the Northeast Asia aspects of that agenda and the enormous importance of raising that agenda and giving it more voice. I'm the editor or the co-editor with Jim Cook of the Journal of Military Ethics. So that's partly why I'm conducting this conversation. I'm also at PRIO, the Peace Research Institute Oslo, which is one of the leading environments in the world for gender-based studies of conflict. And I give a nod to my colleagues, their wonderful colleagues, as Torun, Inger, you know many of them, Betsy. So please go to PRIO's website and look at some of the things we've been doing there. Things coming out all the time. My good colleague Jenny Woodinson recently with a doctoral dissertation on these issues with the African lens. But anyway, I want to link this to, well, let me just mention one more person, Henrik Syse, who was a senior researcher with us until recently and also done amazing work. But anyway, I want to link this to military ethics because your audience is obviously wide. You want to speak to the United Nations, you want to speak to politicians and diplomats. But the way I understand your work, Betsy, it's particularly the armed forces that you want to create more awareness among. You want to make sure that in military education of soldiers and officers, they should have a clear consciousness about how such things have happened, why they have happened, and what we can do to stop it from happening again. And I think you're quite right. There is not enough knowledge about this. So if you mention such things as what happened at Okinawa towards the end of the Second World War, many are actually unaware, even among those who teach these issues. So tell me, if you were to work with directly the armed forces, whether in the United States, in Japan, in Norway, what would you say to the officers who are in charge of military ethics and, for that matter, international law education? Why should they emphasize that, and what should they do? How much should they emphasize history? How much should they emphasize discipline and knowledge today? Tell me, what are your thoughts on how we reach out to military audiences with these issues?
Okay. First of all, I would really like to thank them, actually. I mean, as I said, I was looking at the Tokyo tribunals and the Nuremberg tribunals of 1940s. And I think we've come a long way, thanks to many people who are working at the International Criminal Court, the ICTY, former Yugoslavia, specific persons and experts, who really push the boundaries and the foray of looking at sexual gender-based violence and looking at it as an overall global jurisprudential issue. And I think that because of that, it was absolutely necessary for the militaries around the world to understand that this Resolution 1325 was something that really needed to be addressed. I would really like to thank them for them, but I think we need to come a few more steps further. And I have some concrete suggestions. First of all, to all the, most of the militaries in countries that have the National Action Plan, the militaries are well versed. For instance, like NATO has their own, special section right under the Secretary General on women, peace, security issues, right under Jens Stoltenberg. And as I said, many of the U.S. military academies that I spoke to, including think tanks, have a specific section, or at least one or two, a few people dedicated to the 1325 Women, Peace, and Security sections. The part I think that is thoroughly lacking, though, is the consequences of what I call the paper tiger effect versus reality. What I mean by the paper tiger effect is that, you look at the wording of all the 1325 resolutions, it's wonderful. We highly recommend, we urge, there's all these very wonderful proactive measures that they recommend, to not to hide, not to obfuscate, to bring up these issues, to create a platform like the Women's Voices and to platform the voices of, women survivors. However, the problem is that if you look at, for instance, the status of force agreements, which commonly known as the SOFA agreements between the US military and the hosting countries in over 70 plus countries, which means about 700 US bases all over the world, there is no clause that says that they have to eradicate secrecy agreements or immunity measures that create immunity for U.S. American servicemen who are hosted in these countries around the world. And if they do commit, crimes of rape or other crimes, while they're there, it's extremely very difficult to have them prosecuted. Now, I'm not saying that there are no instances of them being prosecuted, but the burden of finding the guilt and the burden of prosecuting is certainly on the survivors, the shoulders. And most of these cases, they end up being heard in military courts, which is not going to give us impartiality. And even in cases in Japan and Okinawa, where they have been held in the local courts, still the women and their families had an incredibly arduous time trying to get the cases resolved or prosecuted. So, within the national action plans, there needs to be much more concrete measures to investigate immunity measures for the militaries in the different parts of the world that create an scapegoat, that create like some kind of like a loophole for those who committed some crimes to be made accountable for. And this is one of the key problems. So, what I'm telling to my military colleagues is that you can't be waving the National Action Plan and saying as a military, we really want to congratulate the Ministry of Defense for Japan, Foreign Affairs for Japan, and ex-President Obama for executing these National Action Plans. And on the left hand, still do not recognize that the status of force agreements create immunity and secrecy measures. There was the secrecy measures between Japan and the United States that was drawn up in the 1950s, shortly after World War II. Basically because, it was to forge some kind of peace agreement in Japan and United States, for instance, it was really inconvenient for the Americans to be prosecuted by the Japanese courts, when they were supposed to be creating some kind of on paper peace in the continent. And so, what I'm trying to implore for everyone is that those who are actually looking and creating the national action plans, they must really include the voices of the survivors of sexual gender-based violence. My voice is pretty much inconvenient. I realize that, it's no matter how nicely I present things, no matter how diplomatic I approach things, and no matter how goodwill I approach things, what I'm saying is quite, it's threatening to a lot. It's threatening to this so-called, what I call alliances of convenience between Japan and USA. And I think it's also potentially kind of an irritating threat, maybe if not a threat, irritating, because, I'm asking countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Here in Norway, the so-called one of the leaders and champions of gender equality, the next time that your prime minister or your minister of foreign affairs, Saraydi or somebody, comes up in touch with a higher level American, can't they ask about, excuse me, I understand that your national action plan, does not really look at the status of force agreements. We as Norway or any other nation trying to create a leadership in one piece of security issues, we're trying to eradicate secrecy agreements because we really believe in the 1325. If you really believe in the 1325, if the spirit of one piece of security and the inclusion of inclusion of our voices as survivors of gender-based violence, no matter where we are coming from, is supposed to be included, we have to really look at the status of force agreements. We have to really look at these any so-called deceptive or obfuscating or any kind of clause that enables immunity. So this means that the National Action Plan is going to have teeth.
Yep.
Once the National Action Plans have accountability and teeth, this is when it becomes real. And as far as, Norway is concerned, you folks are on the UN Security Council for the next 2 years. It might be an interesting time. In fact, Henrik, what I was really thinking part of my action plan is while, Joe Biden is in the office and Kamala Harris is in the office, I have cautious optimism. I tell people this, that's my favorite line to use, cautious optimism. I watch the news every night. Wow, they're reversing this from Trump, they're reversing that from Trump. I'm not anti-Trump, I'm not taking a political party, I'm basically impressed with the words like accountability, the interest of the Biden-Harris, team to look at the human rights. If that is the case, and they put they did put in a council for women's rights, if this is the case, then perhaps what I'm trying to bring would be the right place and the time to do is at the White House within the next 4 years.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting what you say, also linked to the question of education of soldiers, because the knowledge that there is accountability, that there is no immunity or impunity for these sorts of actions, is probably one of the most important ways to create more consciousness about this as well. So I think this hangs together well, which leads me to my final question, which you've already segued into in an elegant way, namely, what are the next steps? And I want you to be personal now, because obviously this is a big agenda, and we're talking Biden and Harris and Norway and the Security Council. But let me ask you, because in spite of the pandemic and all the restrictions we have now, you try to really keep this alive. You, even within the limited possibilities we have, try to travel. What would you say, if you look at the next calendar year or the next 2 calendar years, what would be your priorities in order to make sure that this agenda is kept on track and is strengthened?
Well, let's say I had a fairy godmother. If I had a fairy godmother or godfather, or, in whatever gender form they might take, and I was given a grant, I would definitely like to go to Okinawa and to basically to try to find the remaining Okinawan and Japanese women who were recruited to serve the US military during World War II. And also the Panpan women. These are women not officially recruited, but these were mostly lay women who became part of the sexual prostitution issues because, Japan was post-World War II. It was so poor that these women found the way to sell their bodies as a way to make a living. And I wanted to find these women. I understand that many of them are affected by Alzheimer's and dementia, unfortunately. And in strong contrast to the South Korean comfort women who are strongly platformed by the Korean government and various NGOs in other countries, the Okinawan Japanese women have not been able to enjoy that kind of platform. So if I did have the means and the funding, I would very much like to go there. And because, I'm Japanese American, I speak 4 different languages: Japanese, American, Norwegian, and broken French or useful French, and being a survivor myself of both child and adult, gender-based violence, I wanted to go in with kind of a soul-to-soul engagement and tell these women, what's in it for them to come out with their stories. I mean, after being suppressed by the governments and politicians and the general public for 1945 minus 2020, I mean, that's 70, 75 years. What's in it for them to speak about these issues? So I'd like to bring in with that, in telling them in Japanese that, although I was born in the 60s, unfortunately, I had to relive some of the issues that I went through. And I think it helps that my mother is directly from Japan. My father is Japanese American, and my mom survived the carpet bombing. And I think another article that was in the Journal of Military Ethics, this is not a product endorsement, but it's just that, this article that was really amazing. It was just an unjust memory. And the title is great, The Moral Obligation to Remember. Now, how much more profound can you get than the title like that? It's by Kobolinsky. And I love what Kobolinsky termed as manipulated memory. You see, that is amazing. I think most of history books, Security Council resolutions, conventions, treaties, pacts, agreements have been affected by what I call manipulated memory. Because as you and I have, concurred on, usually history is written by the conquerors. And in this case, in terms of the history about survivors of sexual gender-based violence have not been written by us. It has not been written by the survivors like us. This has been written by people who want to manage us, who want to manipulate our memories. So by me going to the remaining Okinawan and Japanese women, and basically also Korean women who recruited, who became servitude to the US military, I would like to record their voices before we leave. And I also have this master action plan, as you saw, This master action plan, I was supposed to do like a larger roundtable discussion, but because of COVID, it basically got debilitated. But part of my master action plan was to be like this wheel that was synergized and move the information of what I know as a survivor, combined with other survivors, Far East Asia, present those findings to the UN, present those findings with engaged academics in New York and Los Angeles and Asia, and also go to the UN Geneva, the Human Rights Council. It could also, and very much so, council and decision-making bodies, very much so on education. Because as I understand, in Japan and the United States and many parts of the world, what is being taught in grade school and high school and university curriculum, it's selected data. When I was in, I went to Sacred Hearts Academy when I was in Hawaii, and I went to Christ the King School in Okinawa. I don't remember reading about Alistair McLaughlin's story. I was in Okinawa. Why weren't we more educated on the Battle of Okinawa? I learned about these issues, Battle of Okinawa, through activists. And there was a huge gap in the military, the UN forces and everyone about teaching facts as they are, without whitewashing, without obfuscation. And unless we do that, we're always going to see women and peace securities in Northeast Asia from like strange lens. It's like this session we're having now. If I put Vaseline all over the lens, if I dirty it or if I cover it up, the audience is going to see a certain portion. That is exactly what has been happening. I am here to provide the third eye. I'm not very new age, but the third eye, the clear eyes, the unobfuscated lenses of One Piece security, the way they happen, so that people will have like a more holistic understanding. And so when we talk about the issues of the so-called nuclear threats from North Korea, threats from China and everything, we will have a much balanced and a more intelligent way of looking at Far East Asia. Yep. As many of the ministers, the state prime ministers and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense has said all over the world, without looking at the One Peace and Security agenda, you're not getting a holistic vision of how to create peace in the different nations and world peace. We are looking now at trying to do like a three-legged waltz in Northeast Asia, looking only at nuclear issues. And so my personal master action plan is going to be synergizing those important different agencies, including NATO. And I think NATO has a lot of promise because it's amazing. They had invite, Jens Stoltenberg went to South Korea a few years ago to meet with the president of South Korea. And also, as I understand, China is now, of course, very important. Jens Stoltenberg talks about China a lot on his NATO presentations, and so does Ines Reide. And what I would like to suggest to them is that, great, the first phase, you reach the first phase of, include the importance of China. Now, the second phase is to understand the women, peace, and security issues in Northeast Asia. You need to really understand women, peace, and security issues in Northeast Asia at NATO to get like a holistic vision of why there is this rather convoluted aspect of countries in Northeast Asia not liking each other.
Yeah, I think, Betsy, you have a rich agenda ahead of you, and I love the way you formulated get the dirt and the Vaseline off the lens. I think what you say about the soul-to-soul conversation, side by side with the more academic and political and diplomatic, all of that is very, very important. And thank you also for reminding the viewers that there are academic journals out there that really contribute to this. We could mention a lot of them. We have taken the liberty today of mentioning the one that I humbly co-edit, and you mentioned an article by Kowalinsky in last year's volume 2020 issue number 2 there on the question of just and unjust memories. How do we actually preserve truthful memory, and how do we tell those stories in a way that also play a role today, looking backwards in history, but thereby looking forward and creating a more realistic agenda. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to share these thoughts. I'm sure you and I will have many more conversations about this, and maybe some of them even in front of a camera, the way we've done right now. I hope those of you who have watched this realize both the importance of these issues, also how much there is to learn, what knowledge gaps there are out there, and how we need to address that. I'll end by saying that please go into my research institute's website, PRIO, which is a Peace Research Institute Oslo. The website is quite simply preoccupied.org. You'll find me there. My last name is Syse, S-Y-S-E, so at syse@preoccupied.org, you can easily get in touch with me. And of course, I will be happy to put you in touch with Betsy too, if you want to follow up with her, ask questions, and continue to work with her on this agenda. So Betsy, thanks a lot again for taking the time. Thanks to those who have watched or listened. And I can assure you that this is not the last word on these important issues. Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you very much. And I hope you all have a good weekend. And I definitely would be looking forward to creating more engagement on this. Thank you so much for your time, Henrik. Really appreciate this.
Thank you to you too.
All righty. Bye-bye. Okay.